I never believed in ghosts. Not really. Superstition was for the weak-minded, I told myself. A crutch for people who needed to explain the unexplainable. But that was before I stepped onto Flight 401, before I saw them, before I felt them. The night the plane went down in the Everglades, I was there. I survived. I shouldn't have. I remember the sickening sound of metal screaming against the earth, the way the fuselage split open like an overripe fruit. Fire swallowed the wreckage, flickering reflections of it dancing on the swamp's black water. People, those who hadn't been killed on impact, screamed for help. Some voices gurgled as they drowned in the murky depths. Others were silenced when the gators came. But that was decades ago. Tonight I was back in the air working as a flight engineer for Eastern Airlines. I'd been assigned to a routine Miami to New York trip. A flight like any other. Or so I thought. The plane we were on had been outfitted with salvaged parts from Flight 401. It was a cost-cutting measure. Why let good equipment go to waste? They said it was nothing. They said it didn't matter. They were wrong. It started with a whisper. At first I thought it was the hum of the engines playing tricks on my ears. A soft murmur, indistinct, crawling along the walls of the cockpit. Then the co-pilot stiffened. He turned to me, pale as a corpse. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, feeling my throat tighten. The captain, an older man who'd spent years in the air, brushed it off. Probably the radio picking up interference. But the whispering didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent. Then the intercom crackled. A voice I hadn't heard in years, spoke through the static. "Check the landing gear," it rasped. "Check it now." My stomach turned to ice, because I knew that voice. I had heard that voice the night the plane went down. I had seen the man it belonged to, his face crushed, eyes empty, lying in the twisted wreckage of Flight 401. The dead were speaking, and they weren't done yet. I couldn't breathe. That voice, his voice, sent an electric chill straight down my spine. My hands trembled as I reached for the instrument panel. The co-pilot's eyes were wide, his fingers frozen inches from the throttle. He had heard it too. "Who the hell was that?" he whispered. I couldn't answer. The captain sighed, shaking his head. "It's just interference," he said, his voice laced with irritation. But his fingers tightened around the yoke. I forced myself to move, scanning the controls. The landing gear indicator showed no anomalies. Everything looked fine. But I knew better. I pressed the intercom button, my voice barely steady. "This is Flight 401. Can you repeat your transmission?" Silence. Then, thump, a heavy sound echoed from beneath the plane, like something had just slammed into the undercarriage. The co-pilot sucked in a breath. "What the?" Another thump, louder this time. A jolt ran through the plane, rattling the panels, making the overhead compartments shudder. I glanced at the captain. His jaw was tight, his knuckles white. "Tower, this is Flight 401. We may have an issue with the landing gear. Requesting confirmation." Static. And then, a whisper slithering through the speakers. "It's not the landing gear." I felt the blood drain from my face. The voice was clearer now, more distinct. I recognized it. God help me, I recognized it. It belonged to Captain Loft, the original pilot of Flight 401. The dead were speaking, and they were warning us. The cabin lights flickered. A shadow passed through the cockpit. There, then gone. The temperature plummeted. My breath curled in the air like smoke. Then behind me, a wet, rasping breath. I turned. A figure stood in the doorway. His uniform was tattered, soaked with something dark. His eyes were empty sockets, staring straight through me. His jaw was twisted, broken, as if it had been snapped on impact. It was him, Captain Loft, and he was smiling. The scream stuck in my throat. Captain Loft stood in the cockpit doorway, his broken face twisted into something that should have been a smile, but it wasn't. It was a grimace, a warning. His hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I could hear the wet drip, drip, drip of something hitting the floor beneath him. Blood. The co-pilot let out a strangled gasp, scrambling backward in his seat. Jesus Christ! The captain, our captain, spun in his chair. "What the hell are you talking about?" His voice was sharp, angry. He didn't see him. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. I forced myself to look away, to glance at the control panel, because I had to, because he had warned us. The landing gear indicator flickered. Green, yellow, red, green again. I swallowed hard. We need to check the landing gear." My voice was shaking. "Something's wrong," the captain scowled. "It's fine." Then the plane dropped. A violent lurch sent us all flying forward, the nose of the aircraft dipping sharply. Warnings blared through the cockpit, alarms screaming, lights flashing red. The co-pilot shouted something, his hands scrambling over the controls. We were in free fall. I slammed my hand against the radio. "Mayday, mayday, this is Flight 401. We're experiencing..." A burst of static. Then, "Pull up." The whisper came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Pull up. Now." The ghostly figure of Captain Loft didn't move. His mouth didn't even open. But I knew. It was him. The captain didn't hesitate this time. He yanked back on the controls with everything he had. The plane groaned, metal shrieking as it fought against gravity. I could feel the sheer weight of the aircraft resisting, as if something else was trying to pull us down. Then a sickening crunch. The plane steadied. We were no longer falling. But something wasn't right. The radio crackled again. A garbled, distorted voice pushed through the static. "You weren't supposed to make it." The words sent an ice-cold dagger straight into my gut. I turned back to the doorway. Captain Loft was gone. But something else was there now. A shape. Wrong. Twisted. And it was crawling toward us. The thing in the doorway wasn't human. It had been once. Now it was something else, something grotesque, something wrong, a mangled husk of what had once been flesh and bone, its body twisted at unnatural angles as it crawled into the cockpit. The air turned rancid, thick with the stench of burned metal and rotting meat. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. The co-pilot let out a strangled scream. "What the hell is that?" The captain didn't respond. He was frozen. His eyes locked onto the thing dragging itself toward us. Its head hung loosely to the side, as if its neck had been snapped. The remains of a flight uniform clung to its shattered form, soaked in something dark and glistening. It was one of them, one of the dead, one of the passengers from Flight 401. Then the intercom clicked on. A chorus of voices spilled through the speakers, overlapping, whispering, begging. "You weren't supposed to make it. You should have died." "We did." The words drilled into my skull, each syllable dripping with something ancient and wrong. The whispers filled the cockpit, growing louder, more urgent. The temperature plunged and my breath curled in the air like smoke. The co-pilot was hyperventilating, his eyes rolling wildly in their sockets. This isn't happening." The thing on the floor lurched forward, its shattered fingers curling around my ankle. The touch was like ice, burning through the fabric of my uniform. I choked on a breath. Then, a familiar voice. "Don't look at them." The whisper slithered through my ears, clear as day. "Captain Loft." I snapped my eyes shut. I didn't want to see them. I didn't want to see what was coming next. But the co-pilot, he wasn't so lucky. A wet, tearing sound filled the cockpit. His scream was cut short. I forced myself to open my eyes, and I saw his body sprawled over the controls, but his face, it was gone. A hollow, gaping void where his features had been. And I realized in that moment, they were collecting, taking back the lives that weren't supposed to survive. And I was next. I couldn't move. The co-pilot's body slumped against the instrument panel, the hollow space where his face had been staring back at me. A dark, gaping absence. Blood dripped onto the controls, smearing across the throttle levers. The plane shuddered, dipping slightly. The thing that had taken his face twitched, shifting, turning its hollowed-out head toward me. I felt something inside me snap. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. A burst of static crackled through the cockpit speakers. And then, The voice. Captain Loft. Get out. Now. My breath hitched. I knew that voice. I had heard it before. The night Flight 4 went down. He had warned us before. He was warning me now. I lunged for the door. The captain, the real one, the one still alive, was catatonic. His eyes glazed over as he stared at the co-pilot's hollowed-out corpse. He wasn't moving. Didn't even blink. I grabbed his shoulder. "We have to go, now!" He didn't respond. And then, the lights flickered. A new sound filled the cockpit. Raspy breathing. It was right behind me. I turned, and my stomach dropped. There were more of them now. Dozens. Some still wearing shredded uniforms, others in passenger clothes. All of them mangled, broken, burned. Their skin peeled in places. Their bones exposed, jutting out from blackened, charred wounds. Their empty eye sockets locked onto me. I couldn't breathe. The whispers came again, a chorus of the dead, bleeding through the cockpit, from the radio, from the walls, from the air itself. You weren't supposed to make it. We did not survive. Neither will you. The plane lurched again, harder this time. The engines whined. The alarms screamed. We were going down, again, just like before. And then, I saw him, through the bodies, through the swirling darkness, through the mess of the rotting dead. He stood there, Captain Loft, intact, whole, untouched. His expression was solemn, his eyes locked onto mine. And then he raised his hand and pointed, not at me, at the emergency exit. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the captain, shaking, pulling, dragging him with me as I stumbled toward the door. The wind roared around us. The cabin screamed in protest. The dead surged forward. Hands, too many hands, reached for me, clawing, grasping, pulling. I felt fingers dig into my skin, ice cold and sharp, as they tried to drag me back into the grave with them. "Jump!" Captain Loft's voice, clear, louder than ever. I didn't think. I jumped. Blackness. When I woke up, I was in the wreckage. Not of this flight, of Flight 4-1. My body was whole, unscathed, but I was surrounded by corpses. The Everglades stretched around me, dark, endless. Smoke curled in the air. The smell of burned flesh filled my nostrils. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, and there, standing among the dead, they were waiting. Captain Loft, the passengers, the crew, all of them. Their hollow eyes fixed on me. And that's when I saw it. My own body, still in the cockpit, still strapped into my seat, still screaming. The plane had crashed. Again. Because it was always crashing. Over and over. We never left. We never could. I hadn't escaped. I had just joined them.